Ladies and gentlemen, if you would please help me welcome to the stage Doug Brinkley, Karl Rove, and Bret Stevens with your moderator, Susan Eisenhower.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here. My name is Susan Eisenhower. Great to be back in Palm Springs, Rancho Mirage. Well, we have a wonderful panel here today. We're going to be talking about America today, and it's a fascinating topic in light of all of the developments that we're watching every day. The interesting thing about it is that half the country would say it's the best of times, the other half of the country would say it's the worst of times. And so to put this into perspective for us, Doug Brinkley, how do you think this period fits into the larger historical American experience?
Thank you guys for hosting us here at Rancho Mirage, and Jamie for all the amazing organization he does. It's just the best book festival. Thank you. I guess to start us off, I would say that when, I do history for a living, and I think the point of history is to remind us that our own times aren't uniquely oppressive. Last night we were talking a lot about Last night we were talking, can you hear me? Better? Let me pull that. How's that? I was saying that the point of history is to remind us that our own times aren't uniquely oppressive. And that a lot of what you hear now is it's so bad, it's so terrible, our country's breaking to pieces. And I don't feel that way about it. I say that because when you study the Civil War and go visit those battlefields and realize the 600,000 plus Civil War dead and see what our country was like during that period. When you look at the struggles of women for so long, having no equal rights of any kind, no voting rights all the way till 1920, look at the original curse of slavery and Indian removal and all of this, I think we've made great strides to be America in the 21st century, and I see positive signs all around in our current times, mainly medical miracles. The doctors of the world, that we're extraordinary. Our longevity, all of us here are getting an extra decade or more out of life if we get proper medical attention than, say, 50 years ago or 70 years ago. And even I'm from Ohio, and I grew up in Ohio in the 1960s and 70s, and I was thinking about it coming in here today. I think we're better in Ohio right now than we were, believe it or not, in the 60s and 70s. Lake Erie, we couldn't keep the fish we caught in Lake Erie. Cuyahoga River in Cleveland was on fire. Definitely Cincinnati's better now. Cleveland's better now. Columbus, much better. I will admit Toledo is worse. The point I'm making is that, I think we've got to not be in a doomsday mode. I go all over, not just to book festivals, but to college campuses, and you see these young people, and you see how smart they are and how bright they are and what they're going to contribute. And so just because our politics are broken, and obviously we're going to talk about that. I mean, we have a Congress with a 14% or 15% approval rating. We have a president with a 35 to 40% approval rating. People are really sick and turned off from politics, media, and we're going to get into today the brokenness. But I don't want to be in a doomsday mode that where our country is going down the toilet right now, and everything is as bad as perhaps the cable news food fights make it seem.
I knew that would be a great perspective-building device. Karl, from your perspective, the Republican Party has made a lot of the problems facing this country. How do you think of this in the context of our historical...
I think it all started when we elected Eisenhower.
Okay.
Look, both political parties are broken. It's just that the Republicans being in control of the House and the Senate and the White House are more apparently broken, but both parties are broken. They've been roiled by similar forces of populism. There are two forms of populism, sort of a right-wing populism that tends to be more economic, actually more cultural, and a left-wing populism that tends to be more economic. But both of them have at the core of it a belief that the little man is being screwed and that the relationship between ordinary people and their government needs to be reordered. And both political parties are messed up. But as Dr. Brinkley pointed out, we've sort of been here before. Our politics have been broken before. Next week will be the 229th anniversary of the first fist fight on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. Matthew Lyon, of Democratic Republican of Vermont, said intemperate things to Roger Griswold, Federalist of Connecticut, and they got into an argument, and Lyon spit tobacco juice on Griswold. He was forever thereafter known as Spittin' Lion. Griswold was not a man to take this. We have the leader of his party, John Adams, sitting back here, and Mr. Griswold was not one to take this, so he waited for 2 weeks, plotted, planned, and in early February of 1798, he got a compatriot, Federalist congressman from Virginia named Daniel Morgan, the hero of the Cowpens battle in the Revolutionary War, big, tall guy, tough. And they went onto the floor, and Griswold was a little hobbled that day. He was having to walk with a cane, and he got close to Lyon and suddenly drew back the cane and began to beat the crap out of Lyon on the floor of the House. Members of the House attempted to come up and break up the fight between the two men, but Morgan, who was a big man, held him back as Griswold got his revenge on Lyon until Lyon got close enough to the fireplace to grab one of the fire irons and began returning fire, and the entire House of Representatives went to beating up each other. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen Pelosi do this recently on the floor of the House. I mean, I may have missed it.
Can I add just one thing what Karl's saying? A woman I know named Joanne Freeman at Yale University, a fine historian, is writing the history of caning in Congress. And I thought, well, there's one caning or two caning incidents. It was regular when they'd get in arguments, they'd hit each other with their canes to the point that Karl's making.
But our politics have been broken before. It's broken now. It's going to remain, in my opinion, broken for at least a couple of more years. And then hopefully we will find a leader who will help us move out of the era of broken politics. And this is what periodically happens. It's unfortunate that it requires presidential leadership to sort of set the tone, but it does.
Yeah, Bret, you're in a unique position to be looking at all of the trends and factors underway. Yeah, and doing a great job at it, too, if I may say so.
I'd like to pick up on some of the themes that Karl mentioned. I think what worries me most is the ideological decay that we've seen in the United States and decay in the culture of politics and governance. And yes, of course, you can look back to the 1850s, but do we really want to compare ourselves to the era that immediately preceded the greatest bloodbath in American history? For a long time, I've been worried about the decay of liberalism. By that, I mean left-wing liberalism. It's the movement from the liberalism of a Harry Truman and a Jack Kennedy and even a Hubert Humphrey to today's version of liberalism of Bernie Sanders or a Keith Ellison or other figures on the far left. To me, the greatest indication of the decay of that liberalism is the turn of the Democratic Party increasingly against Israel, which worries me, because if any country should arouse the sympathy of liberals who believe in the rule of law, democracy, gay rights, the environment, and so on, it ought to be Israel. And the strong anti-Israel current among Democrats, I think, is worrisome in itself, but it also bespeaks a real problem in the Democratic Party. The other thing that I dislike about modern capital D democratic politics is the turn toward identity politics. I don't think identity politics ought to represent the American spirit. Identity politics may work in, or don't work, in Lebanon and many other countries that are sectarian countries, but they're antithetical to what ought to be the foundational ideals of the United States. On the other hand, what worries me most, and what helps explain also why I work for my current employer, is the decaying conservatism. You know, when I grew up, the conservatism that inspired me was Ronald Reagan's conservatism of this shining city on a hill, of optimism and inclusiveness and opportunity, that understood that we needed to have government get out of the way of people being able to realize their dreams. But it also understood that immigrants benefited America, that free trade benefited America, that American engagement with allies in Europe and Asia and elsewhere benefited us, that the sort of liberal world order that had been set up by Harry Truman after World War II and then carried on by great successors like Dwight Eisenhower ought to be the core American foreign policy, not the America First that we inherited from Charles Lindbergh and the isolationists and anti-Semites of the interwar years. And what I fear is that under President Trump, the conservative, what ought to be the American conservative melding of a decent respect for tradition and patriotism with an excitement about the creative possibilities of capitalism, new immigrants, and so on, that is decaying into a kind of nativism. And nothing to me makes that more clear than the Republican Party's strong turn against immigrants. When I hear the Attorney General of the United States asking, why should we want these people with no skills who can barely read come into our country? What are they going to benefit? You know, what benefit are they going to do here? All I have to do is think about my grandfather who arrived from what is now Moldova after the Kishinev pogrom of 1903 with zero skills, zero English, probably not the best hygiene, and yet he made the American dream every bit his own. And if you don't understand that about America, if you don't understand how intrinsic Emma Lazarus's poem is to the American dream, you don't understand what this country is about. Even Jeff Sessions, at some point, had an ancestor who arrived in this country probably filthy and probably illiterate.
Well, basically speaking, what you're describing, Bret, is often described as a leadership crisis in this country, about setting the tone, about following through. I would add one thought of my own, which is that what's clearly different about today, in my view, is that strong leadership is defined by people who dig their heels in rather than those who compromise. If we had dug our heels in, we would have never won World War II. It took an enormous amount of compromise, and so that value is shifted. Do we have, Doug, would you like to say something about that? Karl, Bret?
Well, you know, we're talking about time, and ultimately we're dealing with history. I mean, there are bushes in the desert of California 10,000 years old that are still alive. We're looking at a dysfunctional American political cycle now. And I just want to say we got to be careful not to keep exaggerating how bad it is. Our institutions are sturdy. Donald Trump has been attacking them. I've been ill over the way he's treated CIA, FBI, Justice Department, State Department, EPA. But we'll get through this period that we're in right now. What is Donald Trump? What does he represent? He put together a coalition of strands in American history. His hero, we're doing a panel, who's our hero? His real hero is Roy Cohn, because Cohen told him how to do prenups. And once he once he got to be into you know, so there's this McCarthy strain in Donald Trump. There's a Roger Stone Nixon you know, paranoid, they're all out to get me, and hatred of the media. One of the worst comments any president has ever made is the press is the enemy of the people. That horrible line is going to be around Donald Trump for the rest of history, as will his birther comment saying Barack Obama's not born in the United States. These are repulsive aspects to Trump, but he pulled together that 19% Ross Perot vote, which was against NAFTA. in 1992, as Karl knows, with George and Bret. I mean, George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, and Ross Perot. Perot, it always astounded me, got 19%. And all on the sucking sound you hear are the jobs. And so when you go back to him taking some of the George Wallace Southern Dixiecrat energy, morphed it with some of the fundamentalism, morphed it with the Perot, he put together an interesting coalition that lost the election by 3 million votes, but he won the electoral game. Where I'm from in Ohio, I really, truly am friends with all my friends from high school. I know many who voted Barack Obama, who voted Donald Trump this time, and it was over forgottenness in the Midwest. They felt that nobody was hearing them in the so-called Rust Belt. A real good friend of mine said Hillary Clinton never came to Broski's. That's our local diner pizza place that all these politicians would. I said, that's why you're not voting for Hillary Clinton? He said, yeah, she doesn't care about us. Or Hillary Clinton never went to Wisconsin. I mean, she ran a bad campaign, guys, the way she dealt with her email server, and it wasn't an inspired campaign. Yet we're back at like 2000, W versus Gore, a kind of divided, split country, where there's a leadership void, as Karl was mentioning, I think on both sides. I tend to like, on the Republican side, people like Jeff Flake and people like Governor Kasich. That probably tells more about my politics. On the Democratic side, I like Warner of Virginia quite a bit. I like Tom Udall of New Mexico, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be able to be the leaders of the parties. So the big deal when I wrote a biography of Walter Cronkite, 1981, when Cronkite left the nightly news, cable TV's born, social media now. The polarization of people getting their facts from one source and doubling it down, and the anger that we're feeding people is a problem. I have 3 kids in Austin where Karl lives going to school, and I think kids need to have internet instruction, how to use it. We're just saying, here's your, go for it. And they're getting hate sites and false facts and confusion going on. So I think we have an educational crisis where we have to start teaching history in middle schools, high schools, and start using the internet as a tool, not a place to just to do exploitive things.
Yeah.
I want to say something in response to what Bret said about immigration, but before I do, I want to have a slightly different take. I agree with one of the strains that Doug talked about, and that is, in the election of 2016, Trump fashioned a coalition, but let's be clear about what that coalition was. On election day, 35% of the people thought the country was going in the right direction, and they voted for Hillary Clinton by a margin of 89-8. But that means that 63% of the population thought the country was seriously off on the wrong track, and they voted for Donald Trump. This was a reaction, in large measure, an incoherent reaction to the last 8 years, saying the country is changing dramatically in front of us. Nobody seems to be paying attention to us. The smart people in Washington look with disdain at us, the middle of the country, the deplorables, or the people who cling to their guns and their faith. And this is the only choice we have. He's risky. On election day, the highest percentage of the American electorate ever said that neither one of these people was qualified to be president. And they voted for Donald Trump overwhelmingly. 9% of the electorate, 37% of the electorate said, I like Donald Trump and I'm voting for him. And 9% of the electorate said, I don't like Donald Trump and I'm voting for him. Her unfavorables were 54% in the Real Clear Politics average on election day. His were 56. By comparison, in October of 1964, Barry Goldwater had 26% unfavorables. In October of 1972, George McGovern had 21% unfavorables. Now, he won. And he won in weird ways. He wins Wisconsin by 22,000 votes and getting fewer votes in Wisconsin than Mitt Romney got when he lost the state. He wins Pennsylvania by 44,000 votes, and you go to the city of Philadelphia, and there are 65,000 fewer votes cast in the predominantly African-American wards of the city of Philadelphia. Same in Michigan, 11,000 vote margin for him, and there are 25,000 fewer votes in the predominantly African-American precincts of Detroit. This was an election in which the Democrats succeeded in the impossible. They nominated somebody for president whom Donald Trump could beat, and he did.
Can I add just one thing to that? I agree with everything Karl said, except maybe one point. I think Barack Obama left office very popular. I don't think people thought he was broken. He was a beloved president, well over 50% of public opinion polls.
Of his personal approval, but not the policy outcomes. So you can say he's an admirable person, he's an aspirational figure. I'm glad our country broke that barrier. But you know what? I don't like what he did, which is why I think the country's off in the wrong direction. Now, as to immigration, this is awkward for me. His forebears came from Moldova. Mine came from Norway. Now, Norway may be a nice place today because of North Sea oil, but when Olaf Julius Rove, at the age of 16, speaking no English, was taken to the docks in Bergen, or in southern Norway, and told by his parents, "You are the second son. We only have enough little land." I've seen the Rove ancestral farm in Halda, Norway. It is the soccer field, the city municipal soccer field. One field. That was their farm. They said, "We don't have enough for you. We've cobbled together enough money to buy you a ticket and steerage. You're going to go to New York. Here's a train ticket to make your way to Milwaukee. Your cousin will meet you. Your distant cousin will meet you. Good luck and have a wonderful life." He never saw them again. Shows up in Wisconsin in the middle of the winter, spends his first winter living in the barn of his cousin in Devil's Lake, Wisconsin. In order to keep his body and soul together, he makes a lift-top desk. He learns enough English by the next spring to talk his way into the University of Wisconsin at the age of 17, graduates from the University of Wisconsin, marries his college roommate's sister, moves to Milwaukee, becomes a prosperous insurance man, and later becomes the vice consul for Norway, helping welcome other immigrants to the United States. Now, I did not know until I went to the White House something else about him. In 1905, Norway becomes an independent country. We had been ruled by those hated Swedes. And in 1905, we become an independent country, and Olaf Julius Rove is asked by the first foreign minister of the independent Norway to become the first ambassador from Norway to the United States. I have the exchange of letters between him and the foreign minister, in which the final letter is, "It is with great regret I must decline His Majesty's kind invitation. It would require me to give up my U.S. citizenship because it's a price too dear." He came here with nothing. No skills, no language, no nothing, and I got to work in the White House. That says something about the American dream. Even if you're now, I understand the president of secure the borders. I used to have arguments with Jeff Sessions. I'd say, "Jeff, we need to have a guest worker program, because who's going to pick that fruit? Who's going to pick those crops? Who's going to work in those chicken houses, slaughtering all those chickens?" And he'd say, "I don't care if we don't have those chicken houses." And I understand that. The belief that somehow or another immigrants, it's a zero-sum game. They're taking something from me. And what we really as a nation need to understand and need to communicate is a story about how immigrants have added to what is America, not detracted from what is the American dream.
Bret, do you have a comment on that? Do you have a comment on that?
Right on.
Yeah, right.
Buy this book, incidentally. If you want to hear more of what he just said, this is a brilliant book. Buy this book. If you get it in the bookstore now, you can get him to personally autograph it for you. My copy is personally autographed. I thought.
It is. It's right there.
Well, I think this is a very moving account on both of your parts to tell us about your ancestry, and I know all of us have many proud family stories. But I'd like to ask you, in addition to the other challenges that are facing the workforces today, It's not just the influx, the alleged influx of immigrants. Other things are happening in the workplace, like the use of robots, all sorts of other high technology solutions that put individual workers aside. So my question to this panel is, what are the obligations of the elites in this country? Not the political elites, but the business community in this country with respect to workplace conditions. I'd just like to point out that a new report came out recently that 42% of the 42 people in the world have more wealth than 3.7 billion of the poorest in this world, and 82% of the global wealth that was generated in 2017 happened for 1% of the population. 82%, that's a big number. So I would leave it to whoever would like to start off with that thought.
I mean, a couple of thoughts. There's a great story about Milton Friedman, who in the 1960s was taken on a tour of India when it was a heavily socialized economy. And he was taken to a site where they were digging a canal. Men were digging a canal with shovels. And Friedman turned to his Indian government minder and said, well, why don't you just buy some bulldozers? You could do the work much more efficiently. The Indian minister said, well, if we were to do that, we would put all these people out of work, don't you see? To which Friedman replied, well, then why don't you just have them dig the canal with spoons? So the lesson of that and countless other examples is that technology, labor-saving technology, has never been an enemy of employment. And we are falling into this, making the same mistake now. There's a lot of talk about how driverless cars are going to take all kinds of people out of the workforce, but that's a failure of imagination on our part to imagine all the kinds of work that is going to be created when I can be in my driverless car getting a massage from someone. And
Stick with me, Karl. Get away from me.
it's going to be fantastic. The point, we didn't think when we got rid of a typewriter that we would be creating an incredible industry in the Bay Area. Any number of technologies that you can point to always ended up being job creating. Now, I think the question that you raised, Susan, people talk about inequality. It takes away nothing from me that Bill Gates is so much richer than I am, okay? On the contrary, he's the one who's massively enriched my life by being able to facilitate what I do. I'm a crippled, diseased person. I'm left-handed. It's extremely hard to write longhand. And yet, thanks to Microsoft Word processors, I've become an efficient writer. You can point to any number of things in this area. The issue isn't inequality, it's mobility. And what matters is, are our political leaders allowing mobility to happen by getting out of the way of people rising on their own merits? Why is it, for instance, that around the United States so many people need onerous and expensive licenses to become beauticians? You can talk about dozens, if not hundreds, of other industries where government gets in the way. And to the extent that big business is able to use its lobbying power to leverage its access to government and get in the way of people using their own initiative and work to rise, that's what's really, in my view, profoundly problematic.
I'm going to steer us away from masseuses and beauticians and look at the role the federal government has in creating jobs. We're looking at presidents like FDR building the Grand Coulee Dam, building the Hoover Dam, building our road systems, building our state parks, looking at Dwight Eisenhower created the interstate highway system and the St. Lawrence Seaway. Talking about technology, what we got out of NASA, the microchip was created in 1958, and it's the federal government that fed MI. There were 0 computer science departments at any university in 1960. By 62, under Jack Kennedy, 10 schools had computer science departments because of the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo efforts to go to the moon and all the auxiliary things we've gotten out of that, including GPS, including anti-icing devices, including medical devices that save lives, because Kennedy was onto a big, smart public works project that gave jobs that benefited America and benefited the private sector. Ask McDonnell Douglas or Boeing what they thought of the moonshot. What is Donald Trump's big project? An idiotic wall with Mexico that he doesn't know where the door is and Mexico's going to pay in and we're going to pour concrete? That's but what he's inspired as the symbol of public works thus far. And I find the wall an abomination, the whole very idea of it. Tighter security is proper, immigration reform, but this idea that by nature the wall is meant to pull America apart, the language that Donald Trump used to sell his public works project.
Well, I'm not a defender of the wall, but let's give the man his due. Building the Trans-North Dakota pipeline, freeing up energy policy is going to help us benefit from the fracking revolution, which is making us think about this. Today, we are nearly hemispherically independent for energy. We don't need to send a dime to the Middle East. If we need energy, we either produce it here or we buy it from Canada and Mexico, which is good for our country. We buy some oil from Mexico still. You know why? Because we're the only people that can refine it and send it back to them as gasoline. 50% of the gasoline sold in Mexico is refined in the United States of America. Some of it from Mexican oil, most of it from American oil. And so there are things that he's doing. Regulatory. You mentioned right to rise. We passed this thing, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. And one of the first things it does is basically make it impossible for banks, particularly small and medium-sized banks, but ultimately big banks, to offer free checking to low-income customers. And what happens? In the next several years, 9 million people lose their free checking accounts. Now, can you imagine living from paycheck to paycheck and having not a bank that you could go to for no cost and deposit your check, but instead having to go someplace and pay a fee to have your paycheck turned into cash? And that's what the government regulation did. And government regulation in so many ways, as Bret points out, is counterproductive to the right to rise, which Abraham Lincoln called one of the most essential rights of humanity. And so, look, I'm not a fan of the wall. In fact, Trump, during the campaign, I wrote a column critical of the wall. He said, where are you going to build it on the 1,264-mile border of Texas with Mexico that is a river? Are you going to build it in the middle of the river? Are you going to build it on the north side of the river? Are you going to build it in the Santa Elena Canyon where the U.S. border is about 1,500 feet up in the air and the Mexican border is 750 feet up in the air? Where exactly are you going to build the wall? You don't need a wall here. There are places, though, that you do need a wall. It's about 700 miles, 654 miles of wall have built along the border. We need to build maybe a couple hundred miles more on the nearly 3,000 mile border. And I would remind you, when this thing passed in 2005, among those who were voting for the construction of the wall with Mexico and speaking on the floor of the United States Senate in support of the measure and voting for it were Senators Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, and Joe Biden, and Chuck Schumer. So I get it that he gets carried away with the big, beautiful wall, and it really makes no sense along a large part of the border, but he's at least surrounded by smart people like John Kelly and others, Kirsten Nielsen, who say, Mr. President, we don't need that wall along all the border, we need it along part of the border. And look, this guy gets in front of himself. Every successful, think about the stock market, think about the job market, think about the optimism that we have about it, our own personal circumstances, the optimism we have about the economy, the optimism of our business leaders, the things that are happening left and right in response to the tax cut, and all that gets obliterated because he gets up at 6:30 in the morning or 5:30 in the morning and tweets about Meryl Streep's acting ability. Please, stop getting in front of yourself.
But you pick General Kelly, who's a star and a great American hero. There's also Scott Pruitt, who's terrible at EPA. They've gutted I know, but let me say my point, and then you come back.
All right,
they've cut EPA by 30%. So far, the Keystone Pipeline has been leaking and breaking down. It hasn't been. If that's what you're hanging the economic miracle on. Offshore drilling that the Trump people want to do, including about to go after George W. Bush's greatest national monument in Hawaii. Florida is saying, we don't want offshore drilling. The governor of Florida, Oregon, Washington, no, no, no. And finally, last one, and I'll let Karl. The Arctic Refuge. I know many of you here think it's great. Drill, baby, drill, the Arctic Refuge. It was Dwight Eisenhower who created the Arctic Wildlife Refuge in 1960. The lawyer to create our nation's largest wildlife refuge was Ted Stevens for it. Until oil was found in 68, and they've been trying to molest the largest wildlife refuge in our country. I've written on TR. I saw those same kind of energy people try to do that to the Grand Canyon. They wanted to mine it for zinc, asbestos, and copper, and TR said, leave it alone. Because 100 or 200 years from now, for us to have a sanctuary in the Arctic, and for Eisenhower to have saved Antarctica from development and militarizations, these were great accomplishments, and Donald Trump has no sense of that, because he has zero environmental sense.
Yeah. I'd like to add one thing, using my prerogative as the moderator here. I think the way to look at it is you don't want to burn through all your assets right now. So I think of the refuge as being the absolute last resort, but at least we'll have it. So,
but Doug,
okay.
You know, one thing that I worry about, and I sort of piece of advice to Democrats: this country does not need a resistance; it needs an opposition. You know, right now I'm looking at a Democratic Party that is, in my view, almost certainly going to lose, not take the House and the Senate, because of the way in which they have utterly and stupidly mismanaged the DACA question. And if I had to place a modest bet today, I'd say Donald Trump is reelected. And let me tell you why. Because while Democrats are rightly, and I am rightly concerned, I think, about the demagoguery on the press, on immigrants, and so on, we finally have 3% growth in this country. We have 4.1% unemployment. We passed a corporate tax cut. The Democrats said, oh, this is going to be the end of the world. And what's the first thing that happens? Apple repatriates $250 billion. And Democrats are left saying, well, we only got $38 billion in taxes. That's not a good look if you're a Democrat. So mindless opposition to every initiative that creates jobs for Americans who felt that the Obama economy left them behind is a guaranteed recipe for getting the worst possible result. I'm speaking for Democrats here, not for them, but two Democrats here, in 2020. So, I'm worried about a Democratic Party that is not offering any, as far as I can see, any solutions of its own, any seriousness of its own, on genuine concerns about economic growth that simply did not happen as it should have under Obama. We had the weakest recovery in post-war history under Obama. This country staggers under regulations that half the people I work with in the Manhattan media have never heard about, because we have one wonderful unregulated economy, which is the words economy in the United States. First Amendment prohibits any regulation of my economy, but if you're making widgets somewhere, your life is the hell of the Department of Labor and OSHA. That's, I don't think Democrats really are taking seriously the challenge that Donald Trump and his administration present. And by treating everything in this hysterical, over-the-top way, they are losing sight of what they need to do. Present a credible opposition that shows Americans how they can grow the economy better and create more opportunity for more people.
Do you think the Democrats will win Congress this year? You made a prediction. Will the Democrats win Congress?
Well, I think the chances of it have declined pretty dramatically.
So you don't think so?
Yeah.
I would be surprised.
All right.
Carl.
Yeah. Look, I'm not going to engage in responding to every single thing Doug brought up, but let me just give you a couple. Look, Arctic Wildlife Refuge, fine. We're talking about, in how many thousand square miles, having a pad the size of a football field to service gigantic flows of energy that will not only help us but help our allies. And there has to be a balance.
The oil companies
let me finish.
You were right.
You were right.
No,
they do want to go there. That's why they are.
It's too expensive right now.
Well, you know what? we'll see in a couple of weeks, one week,
right.
couple of months. But the oil executives I talked to want to go there, and Alaska wants them to go there because it's jobs and prosperity for their country with minimal impact. Remember all of those dire predictions about what would happen in Prudhoe Bay and how the caribou were going to be decimated, and instead, you know, there are a lot more caribou today.
Instead, there was an Exxon Valdez.
Excuse me. Yeah, there are occasional problems.
The Exxon Valdez was a big problem.
Yeah, well, let me finish. You were right to tell me not to interrupt you.
All right.
So show a little bit of behavior and don't interrupt me.
Okay.
Yeah, there are gonna be problems like in Exxon Valdez. But they're also going to be without access to energy. There are going to be problems where the standards of living of those, particularly at the bottom, are not as good as they should be, and we spend too much of our money sending money to the Middle East to people who don't like us. I want to be independent of the Middle East when it comes to energy. Now, he took a sideswipe at Scott Pruitt. Well, I know Scott Pruitt. Good man. And once again, the liberal view is, what are the inputs, not what is the outcome? Scott Pruitt said, we don't need this many people at the Environmental Protection Agency to do what the law requires us to do, and we're also trying to do things like the Waters of America rule, promulgated by the Obama administration, that said if you have a wet patch on your farm, it is a navigable water and has to be regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency. One of the most stupid things that agriculture ever faced. Can you imagine every farmer and every rancher being worried about some federal regulator coming on saying, well, you know what, you got that dry stream that runs 1 month out of the year, it's a navigable water and we got to regulate you. Forget it. Scott Pruitt will do an excellent job because he cares, as he cared as the Oklahoma Attorney General. He went after the polluters. He went after the people who were breaking the laws and breaking the rules. He is not, however, one of these bureaucrats who sort of goes out there and says, I'm going to do everything I want to do. And final point, and then you can interrupt me. No. I want to agree with Bret. I happen to have had a chance to read a piece that's going to appear tomorrow in the Wall Street Journal. Brilliant. Really insightful, succinct. I thought a very powerful piece. I think I've done a really good job on it myself. There's a new Harvard Center for the Study of American Politics poll. 23% of the American people think that the Democrats ought to resist anything the Trump administration tries to do. 77% say they think the Democratic Party ought to not resist what the Trump administration is doing, but instead make deals on things, on issues they're concerned about. Now, what's interesting to me is, first of all, how lopsided that is, and second of all, everybody has an opinion. Zero undecided on that issue. And it goes back to what Susan said earlier. People want these two parties to stand for what they believe in, but for God's sake, find some ways to compromise and move the country forward. And DACA and border security are those issues, for example. The vast majority of the American people want to find a way to resolve the situation of these the way that these people who are brought here as children are going to be treated. On the other hand, the American people also want their borders to be secure. And finding a couple of $1 billion in order to patch up the existing wall that we've got and build another couple of 100 miles at most over the next 10 years is a reasonable solution. And yet the partisanship is getting in the way of doing what is right, not only for the country, but also for the two political parties.
Okay, so I have to say that we are now running out of time. And I know it's a terrible, terrible thing because this has been such a fabulous panel. But let me just say one thing. I would like to challenge all of you, and I'm sure my panelists would agree, to don't just watch one channel like MSNBC or Fox News. Watch them both. Because what is really a problem today in our country is, as we say, you have a right to your opinion, but not necessarily your own facts. And I think that today has been an extremely interesting opportunity to hear many perspectives on the same set of issues. If we have any other comment in 30 seconds.
Buy America in retreat.
I have just one 30-second one to Karl, and it's a question. George W. Bush believes in climate change. Do you believe in climate change? And does it bother you? If your answer is yes, doesn't it bother you that Scott Pruitt doesn't and that all the scientists think that he's the worst EPA choice there could have
can we
been.
make
Well,
that a yes or
first
no?
of all, I've talked to Bjorn Lornberg, and he doesn't think he's the worst.
All right,
EPA
but I'm asking
administrator.
about climate change. Do
Yeah.
you believe in it?
I believe that.
But Pruitt doesn't.
I believe that human beings have had an effect. I do not believe we know exactly what is the right temperature the world's supposed to be.
Okay, I'm
The,
just
the
asking.
temperature of the world today is warmer than it was before and colder than it was before. So I want an insurance policy. But I want an insurance policy. Think about this. Until last year, the United States, since 2000, is basically the only major industrialized country in the world that has reduced the absolute level of greenhouse gas emissions. Last year, it went up modestly by 15 million tons from 471 to whatever that is, 476. But we have found a way to use energy more efficiently and hold and reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are being put out. Not the same for Russia or China or India or the rest of the world. Maybe we ought to be looking at the sources of that success rather than constantly looking for ways to blame ourselves for it and trying to find solutions that aren't working. Whatever we're doing, using energy more efficiently to grow our economy, employ our people, and raise the standard of living for everybody is the way that we ought to be focused on.
Well, and there's a lot of business in renewable energy, too, so let's thank the panel very much.